everybody. I want to continue our discussion on the question and answers that we've received relating to relationships. The last time we were together in this format, we began discussing the subject of the Apis bull. I don't know if we all remember that. And some people were unsure why I had delved into that subject. They felt that it was not connected to the question and answers that I had received in the past, and I'd changed subjects. I think I took the following week off, or it was the camp meeting, the French camp meeting, I can't remember which one. But at the French camp meeting, I made the point to say that I was continuing that subject of the Apis bull. And what I did was go back over that material that I discussed in this question and answer. And then I transitioned from that subject to the subject of homeschooling. So the subject of homeschooling was topical, not only because it's become a subject of controversy, I might even say a subject of prophecy because of what's happening in France. In fact, if you look across different countries in their own way have got parallel experiences with that of the United States, as we consider the role of the United States in end-time prophecy today. Whether or not you went to Brazil and saw parallels there, of which there are many, both internally and externally. If you moved over to the United Kingdom, you can see clear parallels between the United States and what's happening here in the UK. If you go to France, you see a similar story. So the fact that the issue of homeschooling is coming up in the French legislature makes it a subject of Bible prophecy, in my opinion. And I felt it was worthwhile discussing that topic above and beyond the fact that a number of families in the movement have what I might call a vested interest or a personal interest in the subject. So I was actually asked a question on homeschooling in this Q&A, and I consider it a subject that's connected to relationships, and not just a relationship between parent and child, but also between spouses. And to introduce that subject of homeschooling, I decided to take a step back and consider the material that Elder Tess had presented on the subject of the Apis bull. I'm sure you'll all remember that her perspective of dealing with that subject was that of a warrior king, and how she paralleled the experience of God's people at Mount Sinai when they craft, as the Bible describes it, a golden calf, and the experience of God's people in the time of Samuel and also of John the Baptist. How they had transitioned from, in the words of Elder Tess, the form to, I think she may have called it the character, I'm just going to call it the substance. So I'm hoping everybody is familiar with that logic, the logic that she presented, that went from the form to the character, or the form to the personality, and I'm saying it from the form to the substance, to the reality. And the perspective that she took, as I've said, was that of a warrior king. That's why in the period of Samuel they demand a king, so they can be like the world, or worldliness. And in the same vein, with the same reasoning, the same logic, when Christ, the Messiah, comes, they expect a warrior Messiah. Again, mimicking the world's model of what right and wrong is. That they want to make battle with Rome, we call it pagan Rome, but it's the same idea. And just a cursory reading of Spirit Prophecy, particularly The Desire of Ages, Ellen White will inform us about their reasoning and their mindset. And she makes an important observation, which is the following. She says, if he had come as a warrior king, the type of Messiah that they desired, they would have accepted him. And when she refers to the they, it's not just the masses, she speaks about the church leadership. However, when I looked at the subject of the Apis bull, I wanted to look at it from a different perspective. I looked at it from the perspective of gender or fertility. And what I wanted us to see is that as soon as you start considering the subject of fertility, it can be described in different ways. It can be described as life and death. The sun god, the sea god. The sun dies every evening as it is swallowed by the sea, the fish god, and it resurrects every morning. So I wanted us to see that this whole subject, the golden calf, can be considered as death and resurrection. I'm hoping we can all assent to that connection, that logic. And as soon as you start doing that, when you start considering the sun, then the partner of the sun, if I can say it that way, would be the moon. We know that the sun has its own glory, and the moon is a reflection of the sun's glory. And so you have this symbiotic relationship between the sun and the moon, between the day and the night, between life and death, between death and resurrection. All of these ideas, these concepts, are variation on the theme of two things forming a whole, two things forming a union. The sun to rule the day, the moon to rule the night. A day is, a complete day is night, and I'll call it light. So when we start thinking about this whole modeling of pagan theology, we see it's based upon this idea of duality. It can be described in different ways, in different cultures, in different time periods. And it doesn't take any stretch of the imagination to go from these two entities that form a whole, that you go right back to the story of Genesis 2, where two people become one flesh. And therefore, from these different forms, whether it's night and day, light and dark, death and resurrection, sun and the moon, you get to the place where you see this singularity, this single entity can be described as two beings, man and woman. This becomes an important concept not only in pagan religion, but also in the Judeo-Christian religion as well. And it's not that I'm trying to say that there's pagan religions and there's the true religion and one is right and one is wrong. All I want us to see is that they become parallels to one another. The terminology that we would use today would be compare and contrast. You can see that these religions, pagan religions, have the same model as the Hebrews, as the Christians, however way you want to describe it. When a man and woman come together, when they're married, the Bible talks about it that way, they become one flesh. So if you were to think about a man, you cannot think of a man in isolation from a woman and vice versa. And therefore, if you think about this golden calf, you cannot think about it in isolation as a single entity, because it is a representation of more than one thing. It's two things, and those two things merge together to become one. We saw, I'm hoping that we all remember this, that initially these religions were very simplistic, straightforward, just like the true religion, Christianity, if I can say it that way. In heaven it was all very simple, very straightforward. There was God. We would call that God the Father, but they would just perhaps call him the King. And there was the covering cherubs, Lucifer, Christ, and everything was straightforward until something happened when they were confronted with a strange reality, a reality that they had never conceptualized or been confronted with before. And that was that God was not a singular, I'll call it a personality, I'm not sure what to call it, being or entity, but we'll just call it a personality. God was not a singular personality. There was God and there was another being. In the framework of the Bible, the way those two personalities are framed is Father and Son. So suddenly this whole religion becomes more complex. Not only that, Solomon tells us that there's a time of war, a time of peace, a time of happiness, a time of tears, a time of life, a time of death. So you see all these comparisons between these two extremes, these two sides, which always come in couplets or pairs. And thus, when you get this bull, this singular animal, and it begins to become a physical representation of God, you quickly see that this bull has to, by its very nature, take on a more complex role. It cannot just be considered as a singular entity. Now, they would have chosen this bull, as Elder Tess has described a number of times, I think, by its characteristics, the physical characteristics of a bull. We might consider it strength, courage, bravery, but also this bull will have other characteristics which may not be the initial ones that they thought about when they selected the bull. But what they begin to do is add characteristics to this idol that sometimes are not inherent in the actual physical animal itself. And so it takes on this esoteric representation of God, which isn't true to the physical animal itself. I'm hoping that you understand what I'm trying to portray here. So this bull, over time, begins to represent more than just a single facet or character of God. It takes on other personality traits of God. And that can be described in one of two ways. You can just say God has a different personality, or you can say there isn't just one God, there are multiple gods. And that's the methodology or the mindset of, we'll just say, the Grecian religion, where there are many gods. And we might find that offensive, we might find it disgusting as Christians, pagan if you like. But all I want us to see is that the way they describe who God is can be done either through a singular God with different personalities or multiple gods who interact with one another. I want to remind us of what the Bible says I can find the verse. I can't find it, I'll just paraphrase and someone can find it for me. I can't find the verse, but it's the verse that says that parents shall be as gods to their children. Maybe someone can find it and post the verse up. Okay, I'm going to move on. Someone can post the verse up, perhaps. So, the only reason I mention that is as soon as you start considering that parents are to be God to their children, is that two gods or one God? Just something for us to consider. I don't think so. Okay, if I can't find it this week or no one else can, I'll search it during the week and discuss it next week. So the point I wanted to make was that even the Bible talks about gods in the plurality. So what we've discussed is the fact that this Apis bull then becomes a subject of the relationship between a man and a woman. And the reason why I wanted to consider or discuss that is because of the cultural setting in which all of this is taking place. I've discussed at length at different camp meetings that when God looks at Israel, ancient Israel, in the time period of Moses, and he either counts the people or punishes the people, too often we look at this history, these verses, from the mindset of the 21st century. So when the Bible says that the people sinned at Kadesh Barnea, and the only people that survived that punishment was Caleb and Joshua, and everyone else died before they entered into Canaan, we tend to think that was every person who was over the age of 20. And yet there is clear biblical evidence, if you look carefully, which we have done at previous camp meetings, that it was actually only referring to the men. Only the men were counted to have committed the sin in the first place, those men who were over 20, and therefore the punishment was only attached to the men. There could well have been women who had entered into Canaan that were over 20 at Kadesh Barnea. That was the point that I made. And it's the same issue when you go to Deuteronomy 20, 21, 22. The whole subject of Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 is not about whether or not women can wear trousers or not. The subject is the role in society of men and women. That women are not meant to take on the role of men. And if I can say it, which is a very sexist perspective, of course, men cannot be fearful. In the UK, we call it chicken-hearted. Someone who would run away at the slightest battle cry. Men would have to be brave, fearless people. They were not meant to be fearful and run away and expect other people to do their fighting for them. It was a great lack of trust on their part for them to do that. If you read Deuteronomy chapter 20, Moses discusses this subject. He gives people a clause about what they can or cannot do because of fear. But then he counteracts that, if I can say it that way, in Deuteronomy 22, 2 chapters later. In chapter 20, he says, if you're a man and you're scared to go to battle, in parenthesis, because you don't trust me, God, then stay at home and don't fight. 2 chapters later, he says, if you're willing to read it this way, which is how I understand it, if a man that you know is too scared to go to fight in war, a woman cannot take his place. I think that's the essence of chapter 20 and its primary application. That if a man decides not to go to war because he's fearful, and he's fearful because he doesn't trust God, a woman is forbidden to take his role, his place. However we use that verse, or Christians have used that verse in after generations, is their own affair. Ellen White uses it in her way and other people will use it in their own way. I'm saying that my understanding is that's the original intent of that passage when you understand it contextually. And what that shows us is that in this history, when you start considering the Apis bull and the relationship between men and women, what we need to see is that this relationship between men and women is not one of equality. It's one of, we'll call it headship. That's the term that Christians tend to use. We could call it sexism or misogyny or chauvinism. There are many terms that we could use. Some are more ugly than others, but the sanitized word that we use is, as I say, headship. It's like human trafficking. We tend to sanitize by calling it dowry, where people, women, are persuaded that if they get a good dowry, it means that they have a lot of self-worth. And what they are beguiled into believing is this lie that in fact there's this evil practice, dowry, which they have now bought into, which I'm hoping people in the movement can see is really pretty vile and ugly. So I want to summarize. You start off with a God. You need to represent that God in some kind of physical form. Whether or not you go to the literal or, no, let me not say the literal or the spiritual, whether or not you go from the true to the false, from the pagan to the true religion, you have to represent this God in some kind of physical manifestation. And what is curious is, even though you may be able to produce many verses that say you're not supposed to create God in any kind of image, go to the commandments, it teaches that. That's the very thing that God does. He creates an image of himself. In the time of Moses, we will call it the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. If you move forward, maybe 1500 years, that kind of number. No, probably less than that. Maybe 1,000 years. A little short of that. And you get to the time of Christ, then we all know that this spiritual God, this spiritual being, is going to be manifested in human form, in flesh. And that is not a minor point. In fact, that is the cornerstone of our religion, our faith. The fact that God does manifest himself in physical form. It becomes a necessity, the scriptures tell us, that we are saved for him to become human. So, this idea that God takes on a form, I don't want to argue as being right or wrong. I'm just saying it's necessary. Pagan religions do it. The true religion does it. Whether it's a pillar of cloud, or whether it's God coming down as an angel speaking to Abraham, or whether it's the Messiah, Christ, coming down. And in fact, when he comes down a second time, after visiting the Father on Sunday, the day of his resurrection, he proves his physicalness by eating food in front of the people and telling them to touch him. So I want us to become comfortable with this idea that we shouldn't shy away and we shouldn't be nervous about this whole idea of a physical representation of God. Point one. Once you do that and you begin to see how complex God is, these images begin to take on different forms, different manifestations of characteristics. And through a convoluted logic, if I can say it that way, maybe just a complex logic, you get to the place where this bull can represent two beings, two personalities, male and female, man and woman. Now, when you get a representation of man and woman in that history as this bull, you can't separate that from the culture in which you live. And it's absolutely clear that the culture in which they live, whether you go to a pagan religion or the true religion, has this idea behind it, which is that a man is over a woman. They have different roles in the family, in society. When there's a problem in the church, it's not the women that are going to come together. It's the elders, using the terminology from the scriptures. When there's going to be a judgment made, it's not women that will make that judgment, but it's going to be the priests. And the priests are all male. So there are so many models that show us that this idea of headship is built into society, and therefore it's built into the model of the Apis bull. In fact, it's these very models, these arguments, that conservative Adventists use to defend headship, and if they haven't thought through it that carefully, at least to defend the fact that women cannot be pastors or elders. And the logic that they use, which I think we all are familiar with, is that if you go to the Old Testament, all the priests, which are all the spiritual leaders, were all selected to be male. So they're using that argument, that logic, the very one taken from this 3,000-year-old cultural anomaly, if I can call it that situation that we find ourselves in. They think that that was the right societal culture because God gave it to us, and therefore we are to perpetuate it right into the 21st century. And the reason why this becomes important, in my opinion, when it comes to homeschooling, is that the way almost all families that I have ever met that homeschool on the grounds of principle, of following the direction of God, will almost always do so from a headship model. Because the same material that talks about homeschooling tends to be the same material, talking about inspiration, the same material that tells us how families are supposed to run. That the father is the priest of the household, that he has the sterner qualities, and that the mother has the softer qualities, and that stern and soft quality then merge and balance one another out. And lest you might be deceived, that is not yin and yang, which I'm sure all of us would find offensive, but that is straight from inspiration that talks about the sterner and the gentler side of two people that form one entity, and they, as I say, balance one another out. This is the model that Ellen White gives to us. And without careful consideration, careful thought, I want us to see how easy it is to not realize how offensive and how wrong those models are in the dispensation, I want to say, of truth. Or you might not call it the dispensation of truth, because we'd say truth is always there. Let's call it the dispensation of the gathering, or the dispensation of the increase of knowledge. In that dispensation, things that were practiced in the past cannot just be brought forward without careful scrutiny. And too many of us have done that. Following the camp meeting, where I spoke at length about homeschooling, many people have, I think, got to a place where I think I have been misunderstood. It's not my purpose to destroy or to denigrate homeschooling and to promote the public school system. Like, I guess many of you, I've been through the public schooling system, and I know many people who have, I don't mean obviously friends and families, I mean people who are Christians in the movement, and there are many sad and sorrowful stories of the experiences that people have had in the public education system. So it's not my purpose to promote one and denigrate the other. But what I wanted to do when talking about this issue is for us to realize that some of the arguments, some of the models that we are using to promote homeschooling is based upon, I want to call it flawed logic. If you don't want to use that idea, at least outdated ideas of social norms. So much homeschooling, too much homeschooling, is built around a model of headship where fathers and mothers, and therefore the children, follow sexist, outdated norms of what is right and wrong. And that's one of the most problematic things that you have to confront when you deal with the subject of homeschooling. And if there's something that the public education system can teach us, it's that that is a wrong model. And I wanted people to take an honest and frank view of their thoughts and ideas about how they homeschool their children. And that was the connection between the APIS bull, between relationships that we have one with another as adults, and the whole homeschooling model. How easy it is to warp and distort the mind of a child using, I want to call it these outdated ideas or principles. I'm going to give people an opportunity to ask something about this issue before I want to move on to something new. People have already made comments as I've been speaking. So unless someone's got a specific question, I think people are talking about their own personal experience one way or the other. Okay, so I'm going to move on and deal with some questions on a different subject. Still connected to relationships, but moving away from the homeschooling subject. Often when I get questions, people are trying to condense a complex situation, a complex relationship issue, into a few short words, and sometimes the question can warp or slightly distort the actual situation as the person finds it, and sometimes it can make it appear either softer, less offensive, or more brutal, which makes it much worse than it really is. So you have relationship issues, questions, and the way people ask their questions, sometimes it may be asked in the wrong way. Sometimes it's just the nature of asking the question itself. They can mask the reality of the situation, either making the situation seem far worse than it is, or less bad than it is. So it's hard to judge. So I've received a question. It says this: I know a brother and a sister that are in the movement. The brother hits his wife pretty often. So is that connected to my question?
Yeah.
One moment.
Where we put Courtship and headship.
Okay. I know a brother and a sister, they're in the movement. The brother hits his, I presume it's husband and wife, so I'm going to say wife. It says her. The brother hits his wife pretty often, and he still says that he still practices equality in his family. He enforces a headship model at his home. The question is, how can I help them? So the question is not from the husband or the wife, it's from a friend of theirs. It says them, so I presume it's a friend of both of them. And I don't know if the questioner is a man or a woman, but the questioner is asking, how can the person help this situation? So the first thing I want to say, and I've said this before, and people have either taken it the wrong way or they've taken it the correct way and thought that this was very severe or too draconian policy. But I'm of the mind that we should have a zero tolerance policy on any and every form of abuse, whatever that is, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual. Unfortunately, the vast majority, it's like at least an order of magnitude, which means times 10, it's almost always the problem or the fault of the husband or the man in relationships when it comes to issues of abuse. And I'm saying that the whole premise should be that we would have a zero tolerance policy on abuse. That means as a movement, and that means within the family unit itself. The children, the mother and the father. Everyone should realize that all abuse should never, ever be excused, which means it should never be ignored. Now, I'm not saying, which is where people have been confused, I think, that just because we have zero tolerance on abuse, that means we would do something about abuse in every situation. So I'm not trying to say that every time someone is abused, some action needs to be taken. But what I am saying is that it should never be ignored, because the person who's being abused, if they ignore the abuse, what ends up happening is that the person who's on the receiving end, ends up justifying the abuse. And in far too many situations, the way they justify the abuse is how. I don't know if anybody's got their own thoughts on this. How is it that they justify the abuse? From my experience, what they do is exactly that. They blame themselves. They justify the abuse by saying, perhaps me, the wife, I have been too nagging, or I have been too complaining, or I have expected too much. So they begin to blame themselves. The person who receives the abuse blames themselves, and then they justify it. That would be like saying, if you were black and someone was racist, you'd end up saying, well, sure, the reason they think this way is because I'm black, and obviously if I'm black, there must be some truth to this accusation that I am, that the problem that we're facing is my fault because of how I was born or constructed or put together. So the color of my skin actually is part of the problem, as they say it is. Now we live in the 21st century now, and I'm hoping that over the past 20 years, which is how long we've been in this century, that none of us actually thinks that way. And the reason why we would think that way, I want to say, is because we have been manipulated or controlled or tricked into thinking that. Because we may go down that road, but we all know it's inherently wrong. So, someone has said that they, as a black person, have felt that way. But they also know that it's wrong to feel that way. At least now I'm hoping they have come into the enlightenment that even though society or their own upbringing may have led them in this direction, they know it's wrong, and so therefore they have to consciously resist that. And so in the same way, I'm saying that women in relationships, even though they may go down that road, and I'm saying the reason they go down that road is because of this whole idea of not understanding how these relationships work, that they find it acceptable to blame themselves. And as soon as we begin to have this culture of zero tolerance, I think it begins to open the possibility that women can begin to acknowledge for themselves that it's just an unacceptable way of living to be abused at any level. So coming back to the question, in this situation, in this relationship, it says the brother hits his wife and enforces headship. Now, there are 2 points. There's the enforcement of headship, which I want to say is in the jurisdiction or the domain of the church, if I can say it that way. And there's another issue in their relationship, which is he hits his wife, and that is in the jurisdiction of, I want to call it the state or the government. If this person wants to help them, what I would suggest that he or she does is encourage the wife to go to the police and report her husband for beating her up. I don't know why people automatically don't see that this is the right option and the obvious road to take. Why they would think that they should be patient with this man, why they should consider or have some sympathy for his feelings or his thoughts or the way he was brought up, because all of that ends up justifying bad behavior. And I'm hoping that we come to the place now that there cannot be any justification for gross misconduct. And whether a person wants to change or not change, when it comes to this level of abuse, what I would consider the church, you and I, turning a blind eye to such levels of abuse is actually criminal. So I would suggest to this friend that either they have this sister go to the police and report her husband to them, or go to the man and tell him if he doesn't I think this friend should just go to the police if the wife's not prepared to do that, and report to the police what this man is doing. I can't see any reason why this person should turn a blind eye to this situation. So I don't know if the person is here listening. I don't know if the couple is here listening. But either way, I think the police should be informed. Depending on what country you live in, the police will take various actions. Often in a family situation, they may just give a warning, and that may, hoping that it would be, enough warning for him to stop. If he doesn't stop after the police are involved and a record is taken of the act or the offence, the next course of action is for the woman to leave her husband. So if the police for whatever reason are unwilling or unprepared to take action against the husband and he continues to beat her, my counsel is that she should leave him and seek for shelter. Again, it depends in which country you live in, but at least in first world countries, you can receive state support from abusive husbands. So someone's asked me a question: what about hitting or beating children for the purpose of education? Isn't that inappropriate as well? So I'm sure we're all familiar with can find the verse. There are a couple of verses. I'll go to Proverbs chapter 22 verse 15. Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. Proverbs 23:13. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. Thou shalt beat him with the rod, and deliver his soul from hell. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. So we'll go with those ones. So these are all verses, of course, that tell you to beat your children, and they'll beat sense into the child, if I can say it that way. I don't want, it's not my purpose to trash these verses, but I do want to say that the mechanism of beating your children is almost entirely ineffective. You have two children. One of them is soft and gentle. There's no need to beat that child or to give them corporal punishment, because they can be handled with words. It's much more effective. It's productive of the right results if you just speak to them. That's point one. The other type of child is a much more stubborn, if I want to call it, rebellious child. And what ends up happening with that type of a child is that the more you beat them, the more you actually beat stubbornness into them. They become hardened. They don't soften. The more that rod hits them, if I can say it this way, it toughens them up, makes them stronger. And I don't mean more resilient, I mean it makes them a harder, colder, more rebellious person. So either way, this whole principle of beating children to try to instill good and correct habits in them, I want to say pretty much is completely ineffective. So whatever these verses mean, however literal or poetic we want to take these verses, when it comes to correction and child rearing, I think you'll find that beating your children actually is an ineffective way of disciplining them. Now, I'm pretty sure I won't be able to find this Spirit of Prophecy quote, but Ellen White speaks about using corporal punishment, smacking children either with your hand or with a rod, but beating them. And I think sometimes we have this idea that she advocates corporal punishment to children. But a long time ago I came across a passage that spoke about smacking our children, and she said just doing that once in the child's life should be sufficient to help them. And I think that's something that people who, if I can say it, like or resort to corporal punishment don't realize that if you were to do it once should be sufficient in a child's life. And if you find that you have to do it on a recurring basis to achieve some kind of obedience, you know that this is a wrong method. What it ends up doing is destroying or breaking the child's will. And it's the same method that husbands use when they beat their wives. They break their wills and they become servants or robots or, in the words of Ellen White, brute beasts. And I mean it in the sense, as I understand she means it, that they lose the ability to think and reason for themselves, and they hand over all of that responsibility to another person, the person in authority, the person who's doing the beating. Yes, they become slaves. So I'm not sure. So I presume when Sister Eleanor asked the question, she doesn't agree with it, and I agree with the point that you made, Sister Eleanor. They become more aggressive towards others, especially their siblings or their younger children. I do want to make one point about weaker children, the younger ones. She says towards weaker children, so it's not just the younger siblings, but it often is that. Often parents have a child, and after a while they feel sorry that they've only got one child, and they want another child to be a companion to them, so that they don't, so they're not lonely. It's a question that comes up quite often, and my only comment on that is, if that's the reason why parents choose to have a second child, they are creating a trap for their family. They're setting up a scenario which almost always will lead to trouble, because often the firstborn child is the one that either destroys or corrupts the secondborn. It's not always the case, but it is often enough from my experience. And as Sister Allen suggested, these children tend to become much more aggressive, and they end up mimicking that type of control to others who are weaker than themselves. Just see if there are any more questions that I could address. Yeah, someone says that they become bullies. I think that's essentially correct. Okay, so I want to summarize the question. The question is, there's a couple and the husband beats his wife and enforces headship in his family, and yet he claims to be in the movement. I actually don't understand how he can be in the movement. That is an oxymoron, because he's obviously not in the movement. He doesn't believe what the movement believes. For him to claim that it's okay to beat his wife and to think he's the head of the family, and whilst claiming to believe in the same things that we believe in. So he may be here in body, but he's not here in spirit, and I don't consider someone like that to be part of the movement. I don't think we actually want people like that in the movement. He would be better off moving on if that's what his position is. I think that she should report him to the authorities. No one should tolerate physical or corporal punishment from someone else. And then I just added on to that the fact that we should be, or someone asked a question, I think, how we should deal with corporal punishment or smacking of our children. And it's far too easy to use some of these quotes from inspiration to justify beating our children, but it really is an ineffective method. Society has realized this for a long time, and therefore, they have banned it in many first world countries. It's actually against the law to strike your children. And in fact, if in some countries, if you find a welt, I don't know if people know what a welt is, it's if you smack someone and you get a bump, even if you don't scratch them or cut them, just a bump, and if it's discovered, you can be prosecuted for doing that to a child. And I'm certain that conservative Christians would find that an offence, an interference by the state in what they would consider a legitimate means of disciplining, or they would argue one that is God given to them. They have a divine right to beat their children, regardless of what the state says. I don't know where everybody stands on this issue, but I've come to the place in my experience that I would disagree with that position. So someone asked a question. It's a question that comes up over and over again. It's a new question. So the time in which we live, we know we're in Jacob's time of trouble. We know we've passed the increase of knowledge. We have had the latest presidential elections. We are headed at lightning speed to Pentecost, to Panium, and barring some kind of crazy civil war in the United States, President Donald Trump has lost the elections, and he will not be the president that takes us into the Sunday law. He's not the last president. So this is not a prophetic study that I'm referring to, but I'm only trying to say in the sense of the time in which we live, the shortness of time. The question is it best for us to not have children in this time period? And I think people, when they ask this question, I don't think it is actually a very good question to ask of the timing if something happens. I don't know. Oh, it's okay. So I put something wrong. So, I don't think it's a very good question. It's like saying, is this a wrong time to be married? If people are willing and prepared to have children, they should, as in many things in life, count the cost. And if they are found wanting, then they shouldn't. If they're found worthy to, then they should have children. The problem with having children, to me, is related to the problem of being married. Most of us don't have any experience at either one, and therefore we tend to be bad spouses and bad children for the same reason that we have very little experience in either one of those things. I think the world would call it on-the-job training, which is okay if it's some mechanical, physical job, but when you're dealing with people, it becomes very dangerous that you have to do on-the-job training. So I don't consider that the time in which we live actually has any real bearing upon whether or not we should be having children or not. I think it's based upon whether we are implementing and putting into practice the latest truths that we understand and know. And if we're not, then we should perhaps hold back until we are, before we had children, in fact even before we got married. If you find yourself in the place where you're already married, then consider how your relationship is functioning, if you believe in true equality, if you have the means to take care of a child. And if all those things are yes all the way through, then I think the couple need to understand and work out for themselves whether or not they should have children. Okay, we've moved on to another one. We've got one of those, I don't know how to say it, one of those really personal questions. So let's go. Person's married. I'm hoping these are real questions from genuine people, not hypothetical, theoretical ones. Person says, what if I can't arouse my spouse during sex? This is the husband talking about his wife. He can't arouse her. He says, can I practice oral sex on her to fill the lack that she's experiencing on his part? So really it's a question about, is oral sex an acceptable practice in marriage? I'm pretty sure that if you ask most conservative Adventists, they would find that an unacceptable practice. I've already said that if you look at the dictionary definition of words, that oral sex is actually sodomy. So people who have a problem with the technical definition of sodomy would have a problem with oral sex. And as soon as you start, I think, realizing the legitimacy of intimacy in all of its various ways and finding pleasure in that physical experience, that I personally don't have any objection or any reason why, I don't understand why people would have an objection to bringing their partner pleasure, especially if they can't be aroused for whatever reason in a conventional way. I would recommend that people in those kind of situations either seek some kind of therapy, which can take on different forms, or at least speak openly and frankly to one another. And therapy can either be done through some kind of self-help book or seeing a marriage counsellor. I think open and frank discussion, whilst it's difficult, is really I think necessary when you find that your partner's not being fulfilled sexually with intimacy. But in principle, the question as it's asked, I don't think there's any problem in that. Yes, it's all about, it really is about communication, this idea that we should be talking and open and see what the problem is. Because often, and I'm not saying the questioner is saying this, often it's not a mechanical, physical problem, it's an emotional one that's not going well, that's going wrong, of why his wife isn't being aroused. Maybe he doesn't know how to meet her needs because he doesn't know what her needs are, and if they don't talk about it, it's very difficult to fulfill her needs. And often, if you can't meet her needs through normal intercourse, oral sex may or may not do it either. So yes, Sister Sophie talks about communication. Communication really should be between the spouses themselves, but if it doesn't work, sometimes they do need some intervention, some help from an outside source. Books can do that if a couple aren't able to see a therapist. So next question. Does a man have to have a job, his own place, and be able to provide for his wife before he enters into marriage? So, I don't know whose question that is, of course. And obviously, we should all be able to raise with the chorus, that's a very sexist question, isn't it? So we're all laughing here. The people... oh, sorry, we're laughing for different reasons. So anyway, we're laughing here. Does the man have to have a job, his own place, and be able to provide for his wife before he enters marriage? So the answer is, does a woman have to have a job, her own place, and be able to provide for her husband before she enters into marriage? So we can see, I'm hoping, how sexist the whole framework of this question is. So if we take the sexism part out of this, let's try to address it on some fundamental principles. Should a person be ready, whatever ready means, before they marry? I think I would say yes. So what does it mean to be ready? So does money play a part? I think yes, it does. Does maturity have a part to play? Yes, it does. Does a suitable location or place to live have a part to play in this? Yes. So talks about a job, I'm just going to call that a career. Talks about a place, I'm going to say that's home, and money to meet needs. So if we just spoke about those three things, a career, a place to live or a home, and sufficient financial resources, are those criteria that people should have before they marry. And I think in principle, yes. Whether or not it's one or both of the spouses that has that would depend upon the situation. One partner might still be in education and the other one isn't in education. They both may be in education and therefore their careers are being taken care of, their accommodation has, and they're both, depending on which country you live in, and I don't know what models we all have, but you're receiving some kind of money as a student, whether that's a loan or from the government. As long as the couple are able to have a roof over their head and pay their monthly, weekly, yearly expenses, just at that level, I don't think it's wrong for them to marry. This idea that a man has to have all of these things in place before he can get on his knee and ask his fiancée for, or his girlfriend for her hand, I think is obviously an outdated sexist model, because the wife or the woman should also be in that same place if we're going to use that argument. I think there are other criteria that are necessary before people marry. And I think we're in a very steep learning curve as priests on this issue. And I'm hoping over the past 12 to 18 months, many of the stereotypical issues or concerns or fears that we have had are beginning to be erased. And the questioner asks about a job. Sometimes people equate job to money. If you have a job, you can provide. I was steering away from that, even though I think that's what what was in the mind of the questioner. I would consider a job to be a career. And I think it's important for an individual, male or female, to have their career choices fulfilled. Often they don't know what that career choice is, especially if they're young, 18, 19, 20. Sometimes people go to university later on, mid-20s, for instance. I think it's useful to have your career, at least your goals and your desires of where you want to head, already in place and set before you enter into a relationship, a serious relationship with someone. There are too many cases where people, for the sake of marriage, actually put their careers on hold, or they are willing to forbear pursuing their dreams for the sake of marriage. For instance, they may move locality because one spouse, and it's often the man, has a good job and they're willing, or I'm going to say pressurized into leaving, the woman is, to leave her job, her career, and move to where the man is. I think those kind of ideas, kind of plans, are not healthful to a good marriage relationship. So besides the career, besides the home, and besides finances, there are other issues about truly understanding equality. So for the person to ask this question, perhaps they're not actually ready to marry because they frame this in the context of a man. But maybe that's just the way that they frame the question because they're a man themselves and they wanted to just ask it from a personal level. Okay, someone's recommended we go to brides.com. I don't know what that is. No promoting other websites, please. I thought going on your knee was so romantic. Wait, I like that. Wait until you're 55, someone says. I know we got the number 55 from. I'm hoping that's a doubling there, not targeting any individual. On a serious note, people talk about waiting until you're 55, but there are many 55-year-olds in our movement who are completely in a world of their own, and they would not make fit spouses. I know many I'm going to halve that in a bit, many 25-year-olds who have got their heads on straight and are more than ready, more than mature enough to marry at less than half that age. Yep, maturity in social, moral, and physical. Physical maturity comes around 21, 22, depending on how we count. 18 is most people are not physically mature at 18, I don't think, especially men. Most men are not mentally mature at 18 either. Okay, so someone's asked a question, I think. If an unmarried couple has regular sexual intercourse and has difficulties to stop, what should they do? Marry quickly before they get into trouble. If you have difficulty controlling your sexual desires, I think you're entering into a really dangerous place. I say that flippantly, to marry quickly. Whatever happens, I think you're in a very, very dangerous place, because if you marry because you can't contain yourselves, you can't restrain, it's really not a good reason to marry. And if you're having regular intercourse and you're not married, the question I would want to ask the couple is, why are they doing that? Can diet influence sexual desires? Not to the degree as whoever lie is. Oh, sorry, that was a private question. Sorry, I got a question. I didn't know. Sorry, whoever that question was. Diet can influence sexual desires. Hardly any. It may have a small difference. I don't think eggs are going to actually affect someone's sexual desires that much. But we can agree to disagree. And I don't think meat does either, to be honest. In fact, I heard research that says vegan men have the highest testosterone levels, which means that they're more virile. So that should be recommendations for any women who are looking for men. Look for a vegan man to be a real man. Okay, so enough of that. So I think diet can have an impact. I'm not denying Ellen White quotes that talk about this, but I think some of those quotes, I just think they're a product of the generation in which Ellen White was living from the Victorian age. I think she took some baggage from that. We've discussed this issue already. So, a man or a spouse or a woman, they don't have to have everything in place. It depends upon everyone's unique situation. But it's good to have your life goals in place. I think it's a good idea for someone to have their career and their educational dreams in place, that they're not stolen from them. I think that's what really I find fearful, is that far too many people have a dream for a career, they find someone and they say that they'll put those dreams on hold and they end up never materializing, and I think that is not a good place to be. I think that's more important than the money side of things, although I'm not negating how important that is. And the next one will be someone says, I don't know who's so funny. I don't know if I'm funny or someone else is funny. Perhaps I'm the one who's funny. Because okay, yeah, so someone makes an important point. You're in a relationship, courtship, pre-courtship, whatever, and you do something wrong. You make some mistakes. Maybe you sleep, maybe you do something wrong. I don't think that's a good grounds for marriage. As I said, someone was saying that they're habitually having intercourse with one another, and I said, well, you better marry quickly. Obviously, I was only being flippant when I said that. That was not meant to be taken as advice. Bad mistakes in a relationship before marriage shouldn't be the driver to marry, whether it's embarrassment, shame, even pregnancy. I'm not persuaded is a good motivation for marrying someone. Just because you make mistakes, I don't think we should double those mistakes by marrying someone that we are ill-suited to. Especially if we don't feel comfortable in and of ourselves to do that, regardless of people around us counseling us not to marry. So if you find yourself in a difficult situation, I don't recommend that marriage is the panacea to all your solutions. In fact, it just makes things worse. If things are not right, marriage will make those things worse. So I agree with the comments that's made. If things are going wrong in your premarital relationship, marriage won't fix those mistakes. Correct them beforehand or break off from the relationship. So I think I'm going to stop here. We've been going for a good hour and a half. The next question is a bit more involved, so I think it's best if I stop there. I'm hoping that everybody has found some enjoyment, some benefit in our discussion. So what we've spoken about in today's question and answer is the connection between the Apis bull, the headship sexist model, and the problems with conservative Christian homeschooling thoughts and ideas. We've spoken about abuse in marriage and how we should have a zero tolerance policy. And what that means is we should always acknowledge it. Sometimes we take actions on certain forms of abuse, and whilst at other times we may just have to put up with it, hoping that things will change. If you beat your wife, I think the civil authorities should be involved in situations such as that. We've spoken about corporal punishment with respect to our children and how damaging that can be. We've spoken about the problem that many women face, that they find it hard to be aroused during intimacy. And far too many times, I think it's considered as either a problem on their part, however people would describe it, or something physically that's wrong with them. And I think what people would find that the real cause of their problem is lack of communication, that the husband is actually not meeting the needs of his wife. Having said that, I believe research teaches that generally, and not everyone is the same, it's much harder for women to achieve orgasm than it is for a man. But again, that is, I think, more often due to lack of communication, both verbal and physical communication, between the couple, as opposed to a mechanical problem with women. So I think communication is necessary, and sometimes intervention is helpful. We then spoke about the requirements or the prerequisites for being married, and this idea that a person has to have a steady job, has to have their own home, has to be able to provide. First of all, this is not a man's world anymore. And secondly, I think it's really helpful if both spouses have a direction, a personal conviction of where they want to head in life. And there are far too many situations where, and it tends to be this way, where women give up their careers to be married. And I just don't think it's a very good plan. Current situations that have been in the news recently are the two Supreme Court judges, Judge Ginsburg and Judge Barrett, both of whom were successful lawyers and then judges, and both of them were supported in their career choices whilst being married and also whilst having children. And in those particular situations, the reason why they were successful is that their education, their career progression continued not only after marriage but also after childbearing. And I think those things are as important, if not more important, than just having a job. So I hope I've answered those questions to people's satisfaction. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for your goodness and your mercy. Lord, I know we talk in a general manner and sometimes in a light way, but these questions are real life questions. Questions being asked by people who often are in pain or in need of help and support. Father, we bow before you and we petition all those people who have had these questions, whether they seem trivial to us or whether we recognize that they are severe and important. We place all of those names, even though we don't know them, before you, Lord. And also, as we consider those names, not only as we place them before you to do your good will in their lives, we also ask you to show us what our part is, the things that we have done or said that are wrong, but moving forward, how we can support and help these people. Please help us, Father, as we and now in the upper room experience to press together and to come close to one another. Help us to be directed by our innate humanity and also the meditation and study of your word and the conviction of the Holy Spirit to do that which is right and not that which is wrong. Help each of us, Father, to stand up and to be brave and to be counted to do what is right. Pray for a special blessing upon the sister that is experiencing violence in her family. Please help her and convict those people who are around her who know what's happening to shield and protect her. Be with us, and be with her, we pray in Jesus' name.